And welcome, everybody. My goal with this year's Rap with a Rabbi, thinking that because it's my last official year, although who knows where the future will take me, my last official year before I retire, I want to try to cover the big picture. And the big picture is a Rabbi Encounters the Universe. So that's what I'm going to try to deal with. Let me just play with this for a second. And a lot of the ideas come out of my book, 3 Creation Stories. So this is today actually going to be 4 creation stories. I thought we would start with creation. And just to introduce a couple of very quick ideas. The first one is that any verse of the Torah has multiple interpretations. Any verse of the Torah has multiple interpretations. The rabbis say that there's 70 interpretations. So whenever somebody says, what does the Torah mean, or what does the Torah say, you have to ask the question according to which of the many interpretations. We're not going to look at 70 interpretations at the beginning of Genesis. We're only going to be looking at 4. And 4 different interpretations are going to give us 4 different creation stories. So I'm going to share the screen and do a little bit of teaching here if I get the share screen to work properly, which it usually does. So we're going to look at 4 different interpretations of the Torah, and the 4 of them are called Pshat, Drash, Remez, and Sod. So Pshat is the basic meaning, and the rabbis say that the meaning of the Torah never leaves the Pshat. The simple meaning, what it meant to whoever first wrote the Torah. Drash is the rabbinic meaning. And the rabbis always approached any verse of the Torah with the whole rest of the Torah or the Bible, the Tanakh, all the different books in mind. So they would often compare, this verse means this, because some other verse, we could compare it. And the rabbis took off on that. And sometimes it's fascinating. Remez is the philosophical meaning. The word remez really means hint, but it could be the allegorical meaning. But I'm going to look at it as what the great philosophers of Judaism had in mind. And they had something very different in mind from the rabbis, as we will see. And finally, there is Sod. Sod is the secret meaning. And just to lay out some more of the framework for today, there are 4 words for creation in Judaism that are used. The first word is asa, is to make. Something that you make out of something else. Yatzar is similar, it's to form, but it really is to form from some sort of primordial stuff. Like clay, we say on the high holidays and Yom Kippur, like clay we are in your hands. And the word they use there is yatzar, to form. The third word is bara, is to create. And that's the word that's at the beginning of Genesis. And the word means to create, quite literally from nothing, from creation out of nothing. And we're going to look at that. Does the Torah really say that God created the world out of nothing? And we're going to get to that. And finally, there's a 4th word, which means to flow, to emanate. It's not just that God creates a world, God literally emanates the world. And the Kabbalah took off on these 4 words and say they refer to 4 different worlds. The world of making, Olama Asiyah, the world of formation, Olama Yetzirah, the world of creation, Olama Briah, and finally the world of emanation, Olam Ha'atzelut. And I to put my picture of the nested dolls there. It's like these 4 worlds are nested one in another. So let's go to work. We're going to start with a simple meaning, and this is the only one where you really need a little bit of Hebrew to make sense of it. Pshat, the simple meaning And let's just read, I'm going to read it in Hebrew, the very first verse of Genesis. This is the one we're going to be interpreting. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. We all know the King James understanding of that verse. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That is a very problematic interpretation, as we're going to see in just a moment, because even Rashi says right there, this verse cries out for interpretation. Why is it problematic? And here I'm going to just do a little bit of Hebrew. I've done this before for those who've been to this class. The word "ba" means with or in. It's a preposition. But the reshit is a problematic word. Reshit means the beginning of something. In Hebrew, we call that a smichut, the first half of a smichut. You need a noun after it, but bara is a verb. So right now, to translate this exactly, it says, in the beginning of created. Makes no sense. So I think a better translation is in the beginning of creation, and look at bara as a noun and not a verb. In the beginning of creation, or when God began to create the heaven and the earth. And that is, I think, the proper pshat meaning of it, when God began to create the heaven and the earth. And the Jewish Publication Society uses that particular form. In the beginning of creation, or when God began, this is the Jewish Publication Society, when God began to create the heaven and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I think that is really what the verse means. But what does that really mean? What is the first verb of that sentence? When God began to create the heaven and the earth, and then we have kind of a dependent clause there, the earth being unformed and void, so on and so forth. And then we get back to the main sentence, God said, "Let there be light." The first verb, when I teach my college classes, I tell my students every sentence needs a verb because they don't know how to write. They write sentences with no verbs. Every sentence needs a verb. The first verb of that sentence is God said. So we have God beginning to create the heaven and the earth, and God saying, "Let there be light," and the story goes on from there. But I think you'll notice there's a major problem with that. When God began to create the heaven and the earth, God was sweeping or fluttering, there's different translations, over the water. When God began to create the heaven and the earth, and God said, but before that, God was fluttering over the water. Where did the water come from? And I think that that is the key idea here, that there was some kind of water that was there to begin with, and thus began the creation. The creation story begins with something that's already there. And the water already exists from the beginning. What is water? In general, in Judaism, water symbolizes chaos. God creates the world by controlling the water. We get a number of verses in the book of Job, that other verses in Psalms saying God made the world and God told the waters do this and God told the waters do that. And when God gets angry in the Noah story, God brings chaos back into the world by opening the waters above, and the waters all flow together and chaos returns. But water symbolizes chaos. There's some sort of chaotic reality there that exists, and it was there before God ever began to create, and God is going to bring order out of chaos. And I think that that is the pshat, the truly simple meaning of Genesis. Is it's a story of moving from chaos to order. And let me give proof. The very famous verse that gets us all confused all the time, Vayerev Vayiboker. And there was evening and there was morning. What do those two words really mean? It couldn't be a real evening and morning because there's no sun yet. The sun wasn't created, according to Genesis, to the fourth day. So the word Erev and Boker must have some other kind of meaning. And if you take a look at the Hebrew words The word Erev in general means mixed up, confused. The great commentator Nachmanides actually says that explicitly. We're going to get to him again a little later when we look at philosophy. But Nachmanides said Erev is confused. And we use that word a lot. The Erov is the fourth of the plagues, is a mixed up bunch of stuff. We often say insects. Some people say wild beasts. We don't know what it is exactly, but a mixed up bunch of stuff. And even when we create an Erev, which is something that we make so we could carry on Shabbat, the way we originally made that was a group of neighbors would put a fence around their shared apartments, and then each would bring a little bit of food and mix up all the food together, and that would make it into one shared area. So the word Erev means mixed up, confused, and of course in the evening when the sun is going down, and those who don't drive at night, the story very well, things get a little bit confused. And then we get to Boker. And we get to the morning. What does Boker really mean? At the end of Leviticus, there's a verse that says, Levaker means to distinguish between different things, between good. So Boker comes from a word meaning to distinguish, to make order. In the morning, we can begin to distinguish things. And so perhaps the real meaning was not there was evening and there was morning, but there was chaos, there was order. God made order out of this chaotic primordial stuff. And I think that is the true pshat. I think many biblical scholars would agree on that. But if you think about science, and I'm going to be doing a lot of science, I look at science and religion and philosophy. For those who study science, one of the principles of physics is the idea of entropy. It's the second law of thermodynamics. It says that everything moves from order to chaos. Think of our homes if we don't clean them. Think about a teenage room. Everything falls apart. The order cannot hold. The famous poem, and things move naturally from order to chaos. But Genesis is a story about moving from chaos to order. In other words, it's a story of anti-entropy and how God takes this initial chaotic stuff and makes order out of the world. But there's a world already there. There's something. It's a chaotic something, but there's something, and we have a name for that, Olama Asiyah, the world of order. And that's the first of our four worlds that we talked about. So let me stop the share for one moment here. Are people with me still, I hope? Can people hear me? Okay. Then I'm going to move on to the second of these four worlds. And okay, and the second is drash. How did the rabbis understand this? And the rabbis really looked at that word reshit. The word reshit often appears in the Bible and other places, and it's come to mean the beginning of wisdom. In the book of Proverbs, we have the beginning of wisdom, and we have Reshit Darcho, the beginning of his way. And so it's come to mean with wisdom. And what does it mean that God made the world with wisdom? So this is a little bit of what we call rabbinic midrash. It's the rabbis taking off on a verse. This is from Genesis Rabbah. And I didn't put the Hebrew here. I just put the English translation. The Torah declares, I was the working tool of the Holy One, blessed be he. In human practice, when a mortal king builds a palace, He builds it not with his own skill, but with the skill of an architect. The architect, moreover, does not build it out of his head, but employs plans and diagrams to know how to arrange the chamber and the wicket doors. So human beings use architectural design to build a building. And so, using an analogy, thus God consulted the Torah and created the world. And while the Torah says, in the beginning God created, beginning refers to the Torah, as in the verse, the Lord made me at the beginning of his way. So the word beginning is the Torah, God with this beginning, which is with the Torah. In other words, with some kind of primordial Torah. And the rabbis talk about God actually having a Torah before God even began to create the world. Before there was a universe, there was a Torah. Now, obviously, the Torah that God had is not the exact written Torah that we have. It was a primordial Torah, and the Torah that we have, that we read from every Shabbat, is already an interpretation of that original primordial Torah, that original blueprint which God had when God created the world. But it existed on some kind of spiritual level. And it builds on that word here, Reshit, I put in my notes, which is beginning. The Torah is the beginning of wisdom. Now you'll note that the Christians love the word logos. That's how they interpret this. If you ever read the Christian New Testament, in the beginning of the book of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And to Christians, logos, that initial wisdom became Jesus. To Jews, that initial logos became the Torah. That there is some kind of plan, primordial plan, form, or wisdom that God had when God began to create the Torah. And this rabbinic teaching reflects Plato. Plato became very, very influential in early, rabbinic teaching, because one of the most important Platonic ideas, Plato's ideas, is that there is some sort of primordial matter that's formless, and then it's shaped into a form using a plan. And in fact, Plato writes an entire dialogue in this called the Timaeus. Now with Plato, this primordial stuff, the Greek word is hyel, is made into a world by what Plato called a demiurge, some sort of lesser god. I think of that play and the movie Children of a Lesser God, and it's very much based on this idea that it was some sort of inferior god that shaped the world. That's why there's evil in the world. I am going to be talking about evil in a future lecture, but the idea of that there's this primordial stuff, and this stuff is formless, and there's a plan, and the plan is the Torah, and then God shapes out of this primordial stuff a world, just as Plato believed that a lesser god, a demiurge, shaped the world, put together matter and form. And by the way, for those who like philosophy, and I love philosophy, Aristotle totally disagreed. Aristotle says you can't have form without matter, you can't have matter without form. Aristotle simply says the world always was, that it was never put together, it was never formed. But Plato said there's a primordial stuff. And what is this primordial stuff, this stuff out of which God is going to form the world? Well, Jewish tradition says it's tohu vavohu. In the beginning, it says there was tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu, we often translate as unformed and void and whatever, but the 12th century rabbi Abraham ben Chia introduced the idea that tohu means matter and bohu means form, that in the beginning it was matter and form, and they were all separated. It was confusion, and this idea would later enter Jewish mysticism. So I'm thinking about this entire rabbinic idea that God had a Torah, God had a blueprint, God had a plan, and God had some sort of primordial stuff, and God put a world together out of this primordial stuff. And I think once again about science. Right after the Big Bang, what existed? there existed some kind of primordial matter. We often, scientists call it plasma. There's no atoms yet. There's no molecules yet. There's just a plasma, pure bits of energy. And then these began to come together and form atoms and so on. But the fact that there's a primordial stuff out of which God makes a world, I think, is very much in keeping with science. And the rabbis saw creation as using the blueprint of a Torah to form a world. And the word for formation is yatsar, as we said earlier. So the second of the four worlds is Olam HaYetzirah, the world of formation. In both these cases, we're talking about creating a world from something. In one hand, there's water and making it into something. In the other, it's just a primordial stuff of some kind. But I think that that's the second creation story. But one way or the other, where both the first and second creation stories agree, is that it's not creation from nothing. It's creation from something. It's putting something together. Do we have any questions so far? Or any comments, or am I confusing you all?
One quick question, Rabbi. When did Plato live?
It was before the Common Era, 300 before the Common Era, something like that. I don't know the exact dates.
Okay, thank you. Just curious.
But he began to influence Jewish thought, rabbinic thought. He became very, some of the ideas that are very much part of rabbinic thought. We'll get into this, and when we talk about the soul, the idea that we have a soul that pre-existed us and will exist, that's pure Plato. So there are a lot of ideas.
He was born around 428 BC.
Thank you. 428 BC. Okay, so it's really the 5th century before the Common Era. And on that note, I want to go now to a third world, and we're going to move forward in time now to the philosophers. So now we're going to move to remez. Remez, and I'm going too high here, sorry about that. Remez means hint. Classical Greek philosophy taught a principle, ex nihilo nihil fit. I don't speak Latin, so if I pronounce it wrong, forgive me, but when you study enough philosophy, you get these Latin phrases. And the idea is, from nothing, nothing can come. You can't have something that's totally new. Everything has to come from something. So creation from nothing is impossible. And that was the idea that the philosophers taught. And that's why, by the way, Aristotle taught the universe had to always be there because it wasn't created out of nothing. And that's why Plato taught that the universe was created by this lesser being, but that lesser being had some sort of primordial stuff, this Hayel. But the trouble is, when we start to get to Jewish philosophy, and also, by the way, Islamic philosophy and eventually Christian philosophy, whether it's Avicenna or Maimonides or Thomas Aquinas, they were all deeply, deeply bothered by this idea that the universe should come from absolutely nothing. I'm sorry, that it should come from some primordial stuff. Because then you have God existing and this primordial stuff. It's like a compromise on God and what God is. So that it existed along, and nothing should be able to coexist with God. So they began to develop a philosophical idea that we've all heard of, but it really developed by the philosophers, creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. There was nothing, and out of nothing came something. In Hebrew, the Hebrew is yesh me'en, or yesh me'ayin as it's pronounced. Literally, something came from nothing. And you see a number, I didn't quote them all, but a number of the medieval philosophers say this, that there was nothing, and out of nothing, God made something. Yesh means something, ein means nothing. And what I want to do is I want to quote Maimonides, one of my favorite passages from the Guide for the Perplexed, just so you know that Maimonides was a lover of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle believed the world always existed, so Maimonides had a problem with that. Maimonides also had a very serious problem with Aristotle's view to the soul, because Aristotle believed you can't have form without matter, and the soul is the form of human beings. So when the matter dies, the form should die also, according to Aristotle, but we'll get into that in a future lecture. For now, let me quote Aristotle, The Guide for the Perplexed, Book 2, Chapter 13. Among those who believe in the existence of God, there are found three different theories as regards the question whether the universe is eternal or not. First theory, and this is the one of Jewish philosophy, those who follow the law of Moses, our teacher, hold the whole universe, everything except God, has been brought by him into existence out of non-existence. Creatio ex nihilo, yesh mi ein. So Maimonides said that God made everything from nothing. And he wasn't the only philosopher. A lot of philosophers came up with that idea. Second theory, the theory of all philosophers whose opinions and works are known to us is this: it is impossible to assume that God produced anything from nothing. They therefore assume that a certain substance had coexisted with God from eternity in such a manner that neither God existed without that substance, nor the latter without God. And he goes on, he mentions Plato. In other words, there was some sort of primordial stuff. We've already talked about this, and that existed without God. I mean, that existed alongside God. So God existed with the stuff, and the stuff existed with God, and God made this stuff into a world. Third theory, that of Aristotle, holds that the heavens, which form the permanent elements of the universe and are not subject to genesis or destruction, have always been, so time and motion are eternal, permanent, and have neither beginning nor end. Now, Maimonides, in general, held with Aristotle, so he goes on to say, if eventually Aristotle should be proven right, then we've got to reinterpret the Torah. This is one thing I love about Maimonides. He said, if science proves something, we got to interpret the Torah in keeping with science. If Aristotle should be proven right that the world was eternal, then we have to interpret the Torah in a way that's in keeping with Aristotle. But until then, we have to accept the Moses idea that God made everything from nothing, creation ex nihilo, which, and what's interesting is modern science seems to support that, creation ex nihilo. Now, just to compare, Nachmanides was more of a mystic and took a little bit of a different take on this whole thing. And now listen to a correct and clear explanation of the text according to its simple understanding, pshuto. Remember we talked about pshat. Well, he's saying that this is the pshat. The Holy One, blessed be he, created all of the creations from absolute nothingness. And we have no other expression in the Holy Tongue for bringing out something from nothing than bara, which is found almost exclusively in this verse that God made. And none of all that which was made under the sun or above existed directly from nothing. Rather, he brought out, so what did he create? He brought out a very fine element from complete nothingness. It has no substance. It is energy that can create and that is able to accept form and to go from potential to the actual. This was our second creation story. Nachmanides is going to say that he made some sort of primordial stuff. And this is the first material. Is called Heil by the Greeks. Remember, I mentioned that word Heil. That what did God make from nothing? A primordial stuff. And that's what it means, creation from nothing. And after Heil, he didn't create anything, but rather formed and made the creation, since it is from it that he brought everything forth and clothed the forms and refined them. So Maimonides says God made the universe from nothing. Nachmanides said God made that primordial stuff that we talked about in the second creation story from nothing, and then God formed it. They both agree that God made something from nothing, unlike Plato, who said that primordial stuff always existed along with God. But it's a slightly different version of the creation of something from nothing. And perhaps the Big Bang is exactly this, a creation from nothing. And scientists are still very confused as to how the Big Bang happened. And many of them say it had to do with quantum mechanics, and you can't have nothing. Nothing can really exist. But we really don't know. We can't measure time or anything before the Big Bang. But the idea of creatio ex nihilo is not in the Bible. Maimonides says it is in the Bible, but the simple understanding it's not in the Bible. It's really a philosophical idea that the philosophers invented because they were very uncomfortable with anything coexisting with God. That God exists and this primordial stuff exists at the same time. So anyway, I want to move on to, I don't know why this is giving me trouble here. There it is. I want to become a mystic. The rabbis say that Kabbalah is very, very dangerous to study. We shouldn't study Kabbalah. It said that you got to be a certain age. It talks about, remember what I mentioned, the 4 different interpretations, Pshat, Drash, Remez, Sod. They could put them together in slightly different order, Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. The first letter is Pardes. Pardes means orchard, and they tell the story about 4 rabbis who entered an orchard, which means they got involved in mystical speculation. And the first one, Ben Azai, died. The second one, Ben Zoma, went crazy. The third one, Elisha ben Abulia, became a heretic. And only the 4th one, Rabbi Akiba, entered and left safely. That story is in the Talmud as a kind of a warning. Don't even get involved. So if you're a little scared of this 4th sect, the trouble is that could the world really be made from nothing? And the mystics agree with the philosophers that the world was made from nothing, but what is that nothing? And this is where the mystics came up with a very creative, fascinating idea that the nothing is God. I don't even want to say himself. I don't want to use male pronouns for God. God's very self is the nothing. That since God is utterly unknowable, we consider God, we use the word Ein Sof, that nothing means something unknowable, but it's filled with potential. And God created the world out of God's very self. And here we get the difference between the philosophers and the mystics. To put it in a nutshell, a very complicated idea, the philosophers saw God as separated from the world. There's God, God makes a world, God is one place, the world somewhere else. God makes a world outside God's self. And that separation, that distance, is really what troubled the mystics. And by the way, these ideas I got from reading Gershom Shalom's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. The very first chapter talks about part of what motivates the mystics is that separation between God and the world. They didn't want a God that's so separate from the world. So they said that it's not that God made a world outside God's self, that God is the world. God flowed into the world. God is in everything. And that gets us to that Hebrew word etzel. Atzelud is to emanate, to float. For those who know Hebrew, the word etzel is a fascinating word. It's a preposition which means adjacent to or next to, that everything is next to everything else, that there's no separations. And I take off a lot with my thinking in this, that if God is mind and all minds are next to all other minds, that we're not, I've used this idea before of how can I say a prayer in synagogue in Tamarack to heal somebody who's in a hospital in New York or Los Angeles like I did yesterday? And the answer is our bodies may be separated, but our minds are at cell next to each other. In a created world, God separated from the universe. In an emanated world, God is adjacent to everything. Jewish philosophy separated God from the world. Jewish mysticism brought God into the world. And this is explicit in what I think is one of the most radical statements in the Zohar. For those who've come to study with me in the past, I've taught this, but let's look at this again. This is how the Zohar reads at first. I'm going to read this in the original Aramaic. Bahai Reshi, with this beginning, bara hahustima, an unknown thing. That unknown thing is the Ein, it's the Ein Sof, it's the lo et yadai, that is concealed, that we cannot know, created lehechalada, a palace. So some unknown thing created a palace. Vehechalada, and what is this palace? Akre Elohim is called God. Raza de Bereshit bar Elohim, and this is the secret of with beginning something created God. Let me say that again. According to the Zohar, God is not the creator, God is the creation. The universe is God, which is the creation. Some unknown thing created a palace, and that palace is all of the universe, which is God. God is the universe. God is in everything. And we have a name for the, Spinoza was what we call a pantheist who said God is the universe. But this particular idea that there's something that existed before creation and then it flowed into everything. God is both beyond the universe and in the universe. There's a name for it. It's called panentheism. And Kabbalah is panentheism. God is outside the universe, but God is also in the universe. God is in everything. Something unknowable created God. God flowed into everything. And let me tell you why I love this idea. In my PhD dissertation, I said that God is primordial mind, God is primordial consciousness. And that consciousness, that mind is in everything. We like to think the universe is little bits of stuff, of matter that's kind of moves around by the laws of physics. But this is a radically different vision of what the universe is, that the universe is bits of mind. And this idea is not new. Leibniz, one of the great Enlightenment philosophers, said that the fundamental stuff of the universe is bits of mind. Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who I wrote my PhD dissertation about, my dissertation was on Whitehead and Jewish mysticism, said that the ultimate stuff of the universe are bits of experience, bits of mind. And even David Chambers, who's one of the great philosophers of mind in the world, says that mind permeates everything. That, how far down do you have to go? We often say that mind only exists in higher level things and, maybe in animals and people, in animals. But to Chambers, you go all the way down, it's mind all the way down. Mind is the ultimate reality. And I think that's the only way I could really understand the universe. And this universe, this highest level of universe, is called Olama Atzilut, the world of emanation, the world of everything being itself. So we have 4 worlds of creation. And I'm glad to open this up for any kind of questions or comments, or I hope some of this made sense.
Rabbi, just a quick question, really not related to, I get in the first, in the beginning where it says, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, is that why we always celebrate holidays and Shabbat with Erev, the night, like the night?
Yeah, according to the basic translation of that, the Jewish day begins in the evening. So all Jewish days. And that's why I go crazy when somebody's getting married and I'm filling out the ketubah. Are you getting married before sundown? Are you getting married after sundown? Because, and then I was over doing the wedding up in Boston, and they asked me, when do we have to start? We have to start before the sun sets. We had to check when the sun sets in Boston because the ketubah had before sunset. But that's where it comes from, that all our holidays begin the evening before, which confuses everybody greatly. But
Yeah.
any other questions?
Comments? I'm on. Make sure I'm on. First of all, my father was a rabbinical student who was going to be ordained at the age of 18. And I'm not sure if he left or got thrown out, but I do know that he got caught studying Kabbalah, and he was only 18. He was only 18 years old. But the way I was raised was a concept of God permeating everything. I remember him just talking to my mother, who had this image of an old man in the sky on a throne with a crown. And my father said, no, God is manifest through energy. And if you think, what is thought? Thought, you cannot, the only way that you could coalesce thought is to put it in writing or speaking. But what's going in our mind is an experience, is almost like an energy. And I think back to the Old Testament and the manifestations in Exodus. The manifestations of God are in energy, a burning bush, a column of smoke or fire. And I've always thought of God permeating everything and not just being, and that's one of my rejection of the deification. I think I told you, and in the beginning, man created God in his own image, except for the Jews, where God did not have and I wrote not a PhD, but I wrote a paper in college about this as an anthropology major. But the concept of the force, I remember having conversations with people, the concept of the force of being energy can become matter, and matter can become energy.
That's Einstein, that matter and energy are one.
Right.
But
the concept
of
energy.
Ultimately, I think it's more than energy. And this is the part where I agree with the energy, but I agree that ultimately, what is consciousness? Is energy conscious? And I think the mystery to which I've dedicated much of my thinking, both scientifically and philosophically and everything else, where does mind come from? And of course, scientists will tell you the mind is just the brain. But we're going to study that in future lectures. But is the mind just a brain, or is it something more? But I love the idea that God is primordial mind, and that somehow that mind permeates everything. And I love the idea that all minds are next to all other. Descartes, in his philosophy, divides the universe into mind and matter. And he says matter can be separated. Matter takes up space. Mind cannot take up space. You can't say your mind is here, mind is there. It's the role of mind in the universe is one of the most fascinating things. Of course, Descartes made the mistake, I think, of thinking that only humans have mind, that your dog doesn't have a mind. I think Descartes was wrong. But putting that little issue aside, if God is primordial mind, and if God flowed into everything, then everything is primordial mind. And I think that begins to explain much of what's confusing about science, including how things go from chaos to order, because things naturally go from order to chaos, but if there's a mind involved somehow, but that's for a future lecture, I think. Any other comments that people have or questions? Let's see. Yeah, Maya.
Rabbi, I am out of this confusion that I wrestle with it for many years by making it simple on my mind. To understand this, it's to understand the humanity, the form of humanity. The first story doesn't apply that they want to explain how the world was developed from nothing to something. But the rabbi wanted to say, when the human people start with their concept to understand something which is abstract, that can bring us to know God. It's kind of between the Ramban and the Ramban and Spinoza. The matters where it starts from an idea, maybe that God, that the first line it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God already created all the elements, but one time when God decided that will be the beginning, He created light, and this is the light of the people that they were at that point. And the Bible starts us with 5,782 when the communal mind was able to understand the idea of God. So
I'm not sure I follow everything you say, but the last thing you said,
whatever was created before, the order of the world, the concept in our mind, the ability to grasp is something that is behind us, because we were not able to grasp. The primitive man was not able to know what is light or what are elements that they don't see. So the humanity had to reach that stage where they were able to see what is a power beyond them. And this is the first day. This is the or. This is the light. This is the mind that is able to grasp God. So when the mind of humankind was able to grasp all those something that is behind us, only then God could appear to us and reveal itself. It's like the Bible says, this is the revelation of humanity.
One of the things you said is very interesting, the notion of a communal mind. And if you study Carl Jung and philosophy, the fact man and his symbols, that we have a communal mind, that a mind is not a private thing. A mind is we have a shared way of thinking. And I think it's a powerful, powerful idea. I don't know if I'm going to write another book. Probably I'm going to try.
Because this is talking to humanity. It's a collective humanity that went through the primitive mind to something that's much more progressed when they start realizing that there is a power behind the fire that they were able to produce. And they call it the power behind them. And that's the or. That's the or to the civilization. And this is what the Bible wants to say. When the civilization got to the point where they were able to grasp God, this is when I'm talking like God. I decide to give them the light. But before it, all the elements were there, because the first line of the Bible says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Before the prehistorical thing, God created land and sky. God created the things that you can see them, and God created the abstract, the idea that you cannot see them. And it was all without time, without order, but the Spirit of God was hovering.
Okay, I need to interrupt you because I need to somewhat digest what you're saying, but I think the notion of a shared mind, I think, is one that's worthy of much more thought. If God is mind and if humanity has that shared mind, I think there's some really important ideas there. Jackie?
Yeah, it's almost as if the idea of the development of the mind is a metaphor, the Adam and Eve story when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and their eyes were opened and their mind was developed. That's almost like a metaphor for what Maya is talking about.
Yep.
I've always interpreted that, and that's a whole nother lecture, but I have always interpreted the creation story in the second chapter of Genesis as one of evolution from an animal level of existence to a higher level of existence, a human. And I think part of what makes us human as opposed to animals is we have language, and language allows us to have a shared mind. But that's a whole nother lecture for another time. So
I think just one last thing, you know, my background is anthropology. I think that would make for a great lecture, which I think I'm going to start looking at, is comparing creation stories. Because there are other primitive societies going way back, you know, 10,000 BCE and even beyond, that have creation stories, and some are similar and some are very different. I think that would be very interesting to look at the different creation stories out there.
Helene, good point. The
Gives me something to dig into next. I'm running out of topics.
Oh yeah. Well, after the candy and the games,
yeah.
You get. And by the way, Helene is giving a lecture on for our men's club on games, and I unfortunately cannot stay for it because
I am recording
funeral.
it.
But
I'm recording it for you.
But I'm going to record. Okay, I'm going to let everybody go. Jen, it's good to see you again, and.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Next month we will continue to encounter the universe.
Okay.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good for the mind.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye-bye.
Helene, I'll see you in a little while.
See you in a little while.
Yeah.
More coffee. Bye-bye.